Okay, I see that the recording started. So welcome everybody this afternoon. We're really thrilled to have you join us. I see a number of students and who've joined us this afternoon, so that's great. We're really pleased to have Anthony DePalma with us. Anthony is a good friend of the School of Diplomacy, a good friend of Seton Hall University, an alum of Seton Hall University. Anthony has been a friend of the school since his days working for the New York Times. He would come on campus and speak to faculty and students, always with great insights and stories to tell. And then we were fortunate to have him on our faculty for a number of years as a writer in residence. And he taught classes that were very popular among diplomacy students, especially the growing number of diplomacy students who are interested in a minor in journalism, maybe a second major, or at least were working maybe for the Envoy or the Global Current or something like that, where that extra skill set was very relevant to them. And so Anthony helped those students in particular. So I'm very pleased to have him with us today. He's speaking about his book on Cuba, and he definitely is someone with firsthand knowledge of Cuba. I don't know if I have the number of years. Was it 4 or 5 years ago, Anthony, that you led a group of students to Cuba? It might be a little bit longer ago than that. But in the narrow window, when you could take a group of students to Cuba, he led a spring break trip with our own Dr. Goldfrank, who I see has now joined us as well. And they took a group of students to Cuba over spring break. And I remember when they first approached me about running the trip, I said, "You absolutely can, as long as there's a spot for me on that trip." But there wasn't a spot for me because every spot was taken by students, so much so that I think they increased the number of rooms at least once, and it may have been twice. And so very wonderful trip, great pictures that both of them took there, and just a wonderful learning opportunity for our students. So Anthony, it's wonderful to have you back with us this afternoon. I look forward to learning from you again, and especially all your insights on Cuba, which is just continues to be a fascinating place. So thank you, welcome, and we're very privileged to have you with us.
Thank you.
Well, Dean Smith said a lot of the things that I was planning to say about Professor DePalma. But he was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times for 22 years. He teaches currently at Columbia, and like Dean Smith said, he was a writer in residence here at Seton Hall. His new book, The Cubans, Ordinary Lives in Extraordinary Times, has gotten rave reviews from Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, among others. And we're looking forward to hearing him share with us today all about his book and what impact it will have on our foreign policy. So I will allow you to give your presentation now, and then I will be happy to take questions from our audience after the presentation is over. So once the presentation is complete, if you would please either put your question in the chat or raise your hand. I am happy to give the floor over to you. I do want to thank today's sponsors. We did have co-sponsorship today. So this is hosted by the School of Diplomacy and sponsored by the Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department, the Latin American Studies Department, Latin American and Latina Studies Department, and the Joseph A. Unanue Institute. So thank you to our sponsors, and Professor DePalma, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Dean Halpin, Dean Smith, it's terrific to be back with you. I wish I would have been able to be there in person, back on campus, and see so many old friends. Now, I don't see anything on the screen now. Just want to make sure that we're okay, that you can see me.
Yes,
we can see you just fine.
Okay, great. Thank you for the very kind introductions. The one thing that you didn't mention that I thought you would is that not only have I had a long connection with Seton Hall through the years that I was a Times correspondent and as the writer in residence, but I'm also an alum. I graduated from the university in 1975. My wife and I, Miriam, my wife, we were married in the chapel a week after graduation. And both my sister and two of my nephews are all graduates of Seton Hall. So we have a long connection with the university, and it's great to be back. And it's great to be back to talk about the Cubans. which was, for me, really a labor of love. And given this audience, what I thought I would do is talk about Cuba as a policy issue in general, and then a little bit about the work that I did in Cuba for the book, and then come back out and try to bring the both of them together. So it was just last week, in fact, a week ago today, last Thursday, that President Trump welcomed to the White House Brigade 2506. These were veterans of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, when, with the U.S. backing, a group of Cuban exiles tried to land on a southern beach in Cuba and take the government from what was then a very new revolutionary government led by Fidel Castro. The event in the White House was the kind of policy/campaign event that an incumbent president uniquely has the ability to stage. Trump announced yet another round of restrictions on Cuba, further limiting the ability of Americans to travel to Cuba, the way, as Dean Smith mentioned, a class of Seton Hall students from diplomacy did in 2017. It was in the spring of 2017 when Professor Goldfrank and I took them to Cuba on what was one of the last group trips that were allowed in Cuba before the administration really started to clamp down. In this latest round of restrictions announced just last week, the headlines mostly focused on the administration restricting Americans who go there from purchasing rum and cigars. You could imagine why that got the headlines. But they also basically put another nail in the coffin of the Cuban tourism industry by prohibiting Americans from staying in nearly all the hotels in Cuba because they are owned either completely or in large measure by the Cuban government. So it was a way of restricting the amount of money, especially hard currency from outside, that the Cuban government would have. Also last Thursday, the president shapeshifted from commander-in-chief to candidate for re-election. The Cuban American veterans from the brigade officially endorsed his re-election as president, and he in turn fed them the promise they had come to collect. He said, and I quote, 60 years ago, these Cuban patriots formed Brigade 2506 in a daring effort to liberate their homeland from the communist Castro regime. Today, we declare America's unwavering commitment to a free Cuba, and you will have that, Trump said. You will have that very soon. U.S. policy toward Cuba, and in large measure, the policy that affects U.S. relationship with the rest of the hemisphere, because of the way we deal with Cuba, has for 6 decades been steered by basically this same motivation: winning the precious votes of conservative Cubans in the all-important swing state of Florida. And we can see now how important those votes are to President Trump, and really for any candidate. The latest national poll of voter preference for Latinos that came out just last week gives Joe Biden, the Democrat, a commanding lead of 66% to 24% for Trump. In 2016, Trump took 28% of the Latino vote nationally. But in Florida, the important swing state with its electoral votes, Biden still leads with Latinos, but his lead is far smaller, shrinking to 52% against Trump's larger percentage, 36%, with another 12% still undecided. And what many of the analysts are now saying and determining is that any undecided vote now, or at least declared undecided, is most likely someone leaning toward voting for the president's reelection. So the political stakes are clear, but what about from the policy side? What, in fact, has Washington actually been trying to do? What's its goal for dealing with Cuba over the last 60 years since the revolution? Well, I think the simplest way to put it is that the goal has long been, and continues to be, to deprive the communist government of Cuba the dollars it needs to stay in power, and consequently, to make the lives of ordinary Cubans so difficult that they rise up and demand democratic change. That's basically been US policy towards Cuba since President Eisenhower and then instituted, and then President Kennedy broadened the economic embargo against Cuba in the very early 1960s. Of course, there was also the Bay of Pigs invasion, with these brigade veterans took part in, and other more obvious attempts to remove the communists from their base so close to the United States. But those efforts ended while the embargo remains in effect. Obviously, then, in terms of measuring the effectiveness of any policy based on results, this one would have to be considered to be less than successful. For 60 years, Washington has pursued the same course, sometimes tightening, sometimes slightly loosening, but then tightening again this economic embargo. And yet, despite all that, for 6 decades, Raúl Castro remains comfortably ensconced in his seat as president of the Communist Party of Cuba, which controls the entire island. Last year, the party, through the National Assembly, led a revision of the Constitution, making some important changes like recognizing private property, but they also, at the very beginning of the Constitution, inserted a phrase that makes socialism in Cuba irrevocable. That much we know. But what do we really know about the ordinary Cubans who are, according to the interpretation of Washington's policy, expected to play such a critical role in the eventual success of US policy by rising up and demanding change? What do they think? How do they live? What's their interpretation of the revolution and of US efforts to overthrow the government? These people, these ordinary Cubans, have largely been silenced, both in Cuba and here. Well, of course, we always hear those angry voices in Miami, typified by these brigade veterans, people who harbor dreams of going back to Cuba and reclaiming their homeland. We hear from the tourist who, until this recent crackdown, especially during those Obama Biden years from 2015 to 2017, who were able to go to Cuba in great numbers and basically saw Old Havana and maybe Viñales, a couple of tourist sites, essentially the Disneyland version of Cuba. But from the back streets of Havana and other cities well off the tourist path, as well as small towns in the countryside, we've heard almost nothing. All we got from Cuba came from Fidel, Che Guevara, other revolutionaries, and the official propaganda from the Communist Party. There was an attempt back in 1968 to do a systematic study of the Cuban people and how they felt about the revolution. Oscar Lewis was a famous anthropologist who did a landmark study still being used in anthropology today called Children of Sanchez, about the culture of poverty in Mexico. Right after he finished that, Fidel Castro actually invited Lewis to come to Cuba to do essentially the same thing. Well, Lewis was at first concerned about it because he said, look, Comandante, the way I work, I talk to people and I expect them to answer me honestly, and then I use everything they say in my report. So they're likely to criticize you and criticize the government and criticize the way things are going. Castro told him not to worry about it. He expects people to do that, and nothing would surprise him because he's already been out among the people and he's heard all of their complaints. Lewis started his work, and within a year, when he started sending back some of his early drafts of the report, the Castro government, and Castro himself in particular, were so upset by what they saw that they demanded the project be stopped. They arrested Lewis. They accused him of being a spy for the CIA, and they basically shut down the project. And so it was never done. And it has very rarely, if ever, been done since then. Without those voices, without knowing what it is that those ordinary people who are expected to be this part of US policy think and how they live, it's difficult or almost impossible to unravel the basic Cuban conundrum, which goes something like this. You all know that about some of the positives down there. If things there are so good with universal health care, with universal access to education, including free college tuition, cheap housing, subsidized food, subsidized rent, if all of that exists, why have so many hundreds of thousands of Cubans thrown themselves into the dangerous waters in the Straits of Florida, or walked practically across South America through Central America to reach the US border, or done just about anything possible to leave? On the other hand, if things are so bad, as the brigade and other voices from Miami will tell you, with repression, with shortages of just about anything you need, food and cleaning supplies and housing and cars, and with prisons filled with political prisoners, if all of that exists, why aren't Cubans out in the street every day protesting and demanding change? Well, trying to figure out that riddle is what led me, in part, to write The Cubans, Ordinary Lives in Extraordinary Times. So let me tell you a little bit about the book and my work in Cuba. And I'm going to throw up now a couple of visuals that will help you get a picture of life there. So just give me a second to get this set up. Okay. My goal in writing The Cubans was to present the words and feelings of these underdogs, the ordinary people, as objectively and humanely as I possibly could, without being drawn into either the anti-Castro camp or the anti-American, anti-imperialist camps. Basically, I wanted to present it as objectively as possible. We've definitely, over the last 6 decades, heard too much from both sides and not enough from the kind of people that I met and lived with for 3 years. And I should say right off the bat that I did it with Oscar Lewis's experience in mind, without any contact with or help from the Cuban government. In fact, during all the time that I've been down there, never spoke to a Cuban official. I was hoping to protect the people I was interviewing and dealing with and trying to gain their confidence so that they would not have government watchers coming after them, listening to what they said, or in some way making their lives more difficult than they already were. Right off the bat, I should say that much of what visitors see in Cuba, or Cuba aficionados from, say, here in the United States, what they see is an illusion. They're classic cars, those 1957 Chevys and Buicks that are to die for. And they know about the dancing that lures even the stiffest tourists up on the dance floor. And then there's the music, right? From Buena Vista all the way through rockeros and more contemporary music. all of it with style and with soul. But the closer you get to Cuba, the more likely you are to see it for what it really is. There's rust on the cars, a lot of rust. And under the hood of that Chevy is probably an engine from a Lada, a transmission from some kind of a Hyundai, pieced together from who knows what. They themselves call the cars Frankensteins. The dancers' costumes, if you look close, are soiled and frayed. The guitars that the musicians are using are scratched and out of tune. The grand houses of Havana, like what you see in the restored historic center, well, in many places outside of that historic center, they're simply crumbling. Cuba as some kind of a worker's paradise. Well, during my work on the book, I attended a May Day celebration in the Plaza of the Revolution with what the government said were 1 million people. I doubt it was that many, but it was a lot of people. And where there was not a single voice raised in protest, the way May Day observances around the world are usually marked by some kind of a protest about wages or working conditions. Not a single voice raised in protest, even though Cubans earn $1 a day, where there's only a single union in Cuba controlled by the Communist Party, and where strikes for improved wages or conditions are simply not tolerated. So I went to look for a place where I might be able to really take the temperature of Cuba at this particular time, this extraordinary time. And the place I focused on is a municipality, one of the 15 municipalities of the greater city of Havana, called Guanabacoa. And looking at this satellite map of the fantastic harbor of Havana, and if you look on top and you see that bottleneck entrance, you understand why, for the Spaniards, for nearly the 500 years that they controlled the island of Cuba, this was a critical harbor where they could bring in all of the ships that had taken the gold and the silver from the New World and amassed it before sending it out to Spain. You also can understand why it was such a target for the pirates of the Caribbean. But if you look at the map and the harbor, down at around 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock on the sort of the bottom right quadrant, that more dense area is the twin cities of Regla and Guanabacoa. Guanabacoa is actually older than any city in the United States. It was founded in 1554 as a settlement for indigenous people, only a few decades after Havana itself was settled. It is a community of over 100,000 people, neither too rich nor too poor, a place that I thought I could find an array of individuals and really see what life is like inside an interminable revolution that was going through some extraordinary changes. I started the project in 2017, right after Fidel Castro died in November of 2016, an event that many Cubans could never get themselves to believe was going to happen, and continued working through the time in 2018 when Fidel's younger brother Raul stepped down as president of Cuba, although he continues as head of the party until next year, and then continuing on through the constitutional changes and elections and the entrance of the Trump administration, which made them extraordinary times. Guanabacoa, being on the other side of the harbor, you'd think was very close, but because of the conditions in Cuba and the lack of basically public transport or even private transport, most people don't have cars, it is a victim of what some of the people in Guanabacoa told me is geographic fatalism. It's close enough to see Havana and all that Havana represents as the political, economic, and social capital of Cuba. And yet, because of those many ins and outs of that harbor, to get from Guanabacoa to Havana is a trip of over an hour, if you can make it, which leads most people to rely on this little ferry boat that goes across from Regla, Guanabacoa to Havana all through the day and into the early night for a few pennies a trip. It's the most reliable public transportation in all of Cuba. It also was the object of several hijackings back in the nadir of what was called the special period of deprivation and a lack of money back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And with that collapse went billions of dollars in subsidies that had kept the Cuban Revolution going. And suddenly that was gone, and conditions got very bad very quickly, leading to basically an epidemic in the summer of 1994, which we can consider the nadir of hijackings of this little flat-bottom boat. It's basically a barge. It's supposed to have a capacity of about 75, but sometimes you'd have almost 200 people crowded on board. And they would hijack the ferry and try to get it as far out into the water, close to the close to the shores of Florida as they could get. Eventually, most of them got as far as international waters, where the U.S. Coast Guard would come in and offer the people on board the opportunity to come to the United States or to go back. That summer, and these hijackings led to basically a hysteria in Guanabacoa and in Havana that in August, in the heat of summer, led to this singular event that's now known as the Maleconazo. The Malecon is the seaside boulevard that goes along Havana. You see it in almost all of the photographs. People amassed there trying to get on one of these ferries, or with rumors that there were boats coming in from Florida. When they didn't show up and the police started to try to move people, basically a riot broke out, and there were people doing the unheard of, running down the street shouting Libertad, freedom, and abajo Fidel, down with Fidel. That was the first and only time there's ever been that kind of mass protest in Cuba since the revolution. And it basically petered out around the time that Fidel showed up on the waterfront to sort of calm things down. And it's very important to keep that in mind, that his personal charisma, despite the fact that people were unhappy with conditions there, was enough to get people to go back. So keep that in mind as we talk about the future later on. That event, even though it happened in 1994 when I started on the book, was still very much in the mind of the Cuban regime. And so I noticed that as I took the ferry back and forth, they filled up the little ferry pretty frequently. And when I asked, I found, as in this particular instance, that they would put into the ferry no more than 10 liters. In this case, it's 8.36 liters of diesel fuel, which is only enough to basically make a complete circuit across the harbor and back once. It's their safeguard to ensure that no one would ever think again of trying to hijack the ferry, even though in 2003, as recently as 2003, when another group of young men did attempt to hijack the ferry and were stopped, they were immediately arrested and imprisoned, and within days they were put on trial, convicted. 2 of them were executed, and the others to this day remain in prison, which is a pretty strong incentive not to try anything like that again. So Guanabacoa became the place where I was going to do this study. It's an easy bus ride from the ferry landing up the hill through Regla, or There were many times when the bus took so long to get there that I simply walked. It was a couple of miles uphill, and it wasn't so bad. Old Guanabacoa is sprawling from the outskirts of the municipality of Havana almost to the northern seacoast. But there is a central core of old colonial Guanabacoa, which was mostly where I did my work, filled with what you saw were vestiges of an earlier time. In many instances, like this one, which is a house known as the Casa de Cadenas in Guanabacoa, with a history going back to the early 17th century, there were not enough funds nor enough attention paid to save them, even though it is part of Havana, and the restoration of historic Havana, led by Eusebio Leal, who died just earlier this year, has won awards and been recognized around the world for the tremendous work that he did. He never was able to give other than verbal assurances that he was concerned about Guanabacoa to the people there. And as a result, they've lost a lot of their heritage. The people there are what you would consider typical of Cuba, a mix of races, a mix of backgrounds. It was what you would consider a working class or lower working class community, although as the conditions in Cuba worsened, many people didn't have work. A lot of the businesses that did exist years ago no longer exist, but Cubans are always inventive, and they've made up ways to work around those difficulties. This is a meat truck that comes in once a week on Thursdays, parks right alongside the church, and provides basic foodstuffs outside of the subsidized libreta. So every Cuban receives this little ration book that gets them at a very low subsidized price basics for the month. In addition to that, there are markets like this one where growers and ranchers can bring in their vegetables and meat from the countryside, sell them at controlled prices set by the government, but outside of the libreta. So that means that no Cuban has an actual right to this. You get it if you have enough money. And then there's another third layer where products sometimes are called liberated. And there you can buy as many as you want as long as you have enough money. And then the money, there are 3 different currencies in Cuba, and we can talk about that later if anybody brings that up as a question. Cubans make do and have been making do for 60 years. So when there are no boxes, no cardboard boxes for birthday cakes, Cubans simply have developed a way of carrying and balancing in their hands a cake without losing any of the embellishments on top of it. They don't have fuel for taxis, and many of them don't have taxis or cars, so horses and carts are still very much a part of the scene in Guanabacoa. This sense of making do, this adaptability, is, I found out this time, directly from the Cubans themselves, what they consider to be their greatest strength. But at the same time, it also condemns them to living with and within the restraints of a system where there is essentially no accountability for government officials. Adaptability, I guess you could consider it complacency if you took that kind of basically a harsh view, or if you looked at it more with more empathy. These are people who now have so little that they're not willing or they're afraid to sacrifice the little that they have in order to be out there and have their voices heard. This is an important consideration when we consider U.S. policy being to make conditions so difficult that they demand change. As difficult as they are, they figure out ways to adapt. Guanabacoa is also known for its mix of religions, including this church. Basically, it's a religious compound, church, convent, seminary, and school, called Los Escolapios for the scapular fathers, Escolapio fathers from Spain. Guanabacoa is also the place where there's the oldest chapel in Cuba. Los Escolapios, everything but the church itself, which is on the left-hand side of that larger building, has been taken over by the government. So the government took over the convent. Of course, there are no nuns there now. Took over the school, which went from a private boys' school to now a co-ed elementary school. And all of the other buildings, including the auditorium, taken over by the government. The government painted, while I was there, all of their part of the compound, but did not touch the church part, which still belongs to the Escolapios fathers and is basically collapsing in on itself. Besides these once grand, now festering religious compounds, there are also several other denominations, including evangelical and Pentecostal, as well as a thriving Methodist church, and 2 Jewish cemeteries, and many, many temples and gathering places dedicated to the Afro-Cuban mix of Catholic and African religions known as, generally as Santeria, but also Abacua, and various others. But go back to the years before the revolution, and it was essentially a place where the Catholic Church was dominant, and where the religious festival for the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in August was the highlight, basically the social highlight of the entire year. It came to be known as La Tutelar, and for 40 years after the revolution, after Fidel took over, the annual procession in which they brought out the statue of the Virgin and other statues and paraded through the street for hours was prohibited. The faithful continued to celebrate Mass on August 15th, and they would march the statue around the interior of the church, shouting, take her out," while outside the church, there were protesters who were aligned with the government who shouted back, "Keep her in, don't let her out." After Pope John Paul II's visit in the late 1990s, they were allowed to resume the processions and to bring the statue out, but it little resembled the gigantic feast that it once was. This year, this summer, August 15th, the procession was canceled because of COVID. But I was there in 2018 for the procession, and as I was talking to people, I ran into this woman, Caridad Guerra, who's actually linked to one of the most tragic incidents in the history of the Cuban Revolution, which happened to have its origins right there in Guanabacoa. So I knew about it. I hadn't planned on talking to her. It was a happenstance that I met her. Basically, remember that summer of 1994, the nadir of the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. On July 13th of 1994, there was an attempt by dozens of Cubans, most of them from Guanabacoa, who were desperate for a new life and fed up with conditions in Cuba, basically to hijack an old tugboat called the 13 de Marzo, 13th of March, and try to sail it to Key West. There were 68 people crowded aboard. When they got 7 miles off the coast, they were accosted by 3 other Cuban vessels that attempted to stop them, eventually ramming the old tugboat and sinking it. Of the 68 people aboard, 37 did not survive, including 4 members of Caridad Guerra's family. You can see them there. Even now, 26 years later, she continues struggling to try to get death certificates from the government for her daughter, her son-in-law, her granddaughter, and her own brother to ensure the line of property ownership, because she owned the property with her daughter. In all those years, the government has continued to deny responsibility for the sinking and refusing to acknowledge even that these individuals were on board. Basically, the government's position is that they simply ceased to exist. I also met Jorge Garcia on the leftmost side of your screen, a veteran of the Angola Wars, born and raised in Guanabacoa. On that night, July 13th, 1994, 15 members of his family boarded the tugboat. Only one of them, his daughter Maria Victoria, third from the right, came back. Garcia and his daughter and the rest of the family remained in Guanabacoa for years after the sinking, but they suffered reprisals and were treated as outcasts until in 1999, during a visit by the Pope, he and his daughter, along with his wife, other son, and the other family's members that you see there, left Cuba and resettled in Miami as refugees. Only one grandson, Jorgito, still remains in Guanabacoa, and I met him there playing piano at Sunday services at the Methodist Church. Garcia lives in Miami now, and while I've known him since 2017, he's testified several times before the International Commission for the Prosecution of Crimes Against Humanity of the Castro regime, even though he fully realizes how slim the chances are of any prosecution actually going forward. But he told me he owed it to his son, Joel, and his 10-year-old grandson, Juan Mario, who he called Juanmi, who both died in that incident, along with the others who drowned that night, to keep trying. Another part of the extraordinary times that I was trying to capture is that in 2011, Raul Castro, who was president in place of Fidel, pushed through some pretty extensive changes in the socialist system in Cuba, something that his brother, who was much more of an ideologue, always resisted. He essentially allowed Cubans to set up their own small businesses, to become self-employed. Cuenta propista means somebody working for their own account, self-employed. And they put out this guide, and they issued licenses for some 200 different categories of self-employed work. While the government allowed people to sort of tiptoe into capitalism, and about 500,000 people did take out licenses, the government was not really willing to allow any of them to become too successful. The goal was to have a rich country without rich people. You shouldn't be fooled by the term self-employed. The licenses that were given in those 200 categories were all small scale, basically restaurants and cafes with limits, only one restaurant at the time. Also things like becoming a spark plug cleaner, taking used spark plugs, cleaning them, and then reselling them. Repairing mattresses, or peeling fruit. There is still a license for bathroom attendant. And it's more complicated in that because it's ranked by the quality of the bathroom, basically from a very high quality bathroom, public bathroom, to a very low quality, squalid bathroom like the one in the center of Guanabacoa. The rate universally at all of them is set at 1 Cuban peso, about 4 cents. But it gives the attendants who paid for the license the right to charge whatever the market would bear for additional services, like providing soap and toilet paper. Despite all the restrictions, that adaptability that Cubans have so impressively shown applies as well to setting up your own business. It's amazing the resourceful way they've found of finding supplies for their businesses in a country where there is no wholesale market and individuals are not allowed to import material for their businesses. So in this case, this man is taking an old discarded truck tire. You can see there's hardly any tread on it. And using a sharpened machete, he's slicing off a spiral of the tire. You think of it about like the way you would peel an apple, and using the strips, those 1-inch wide strips, as webbing for the chairs and sofas that he repairs and reupholsters as part of his business, his licensed business. Now, one thing I've learned about Cuba from the Cubans themselves is that every Cuban is, or one day will be, a criminal. In order to get medicine, you have a receipt, you have a prescription from the doctor, you go to the pharmacy says, well, it's not here, but don't you know somebody a la izquierda, on the black market on the left, who maybe has some? And the way they would get it is that they'd be at the warehouse where the medicines are manufactured. They would steal some and then resell it to other people. You're going to set up a business as a self-employed vegetable seller out on the street. So you need a cart. Well, you patch together a couple of pieces of wood and then you need wheels for the cart. Well, you can't go to Home Depot for the wheels. So you steal them from the bottom of these garbage containers. Eventually, even these containers disappeared when people stole them and cut up the plastic, melted it down, and reused it as the soles of sneakers that they manufactured and sold in a flea market. Stealing has become a way of life. Not to steal from your neighbors, although sometimes you do that, but mostly if you're stealing from the state, stealing these wheels, stealing aluminum from the aluminum factory, stealing issues of the Communist Party daily newspaper Granma, not because news is prized or there's so much in there that's valuable, but because toilet paper is scarce. It's okay to steal from the state. That's not even called stealing anymore. It's called resolviendo, resolving things. That's the way you get along. That's the way you survive from day to day. It's a part of what I observed as a moral diminishment in Cuba, in Cuban culture, brought on by necessity. The people in the book who had their own stories of living through an interminable revolution, regardless of whether they support it or not. I did speak to the head of the local committee for the defense of the revolution, who remained resolvedly communist and proud of it, with no intention of changing and no desire for change. I spoke to a renowned artist who studied in Moscow during the height of the revolution, when the Soviet Union and Cuba were allies, and it became possible for Cuba as part of the communist bloc to send students to other communist countries to study. The artist gained the favor of the government, despite his own feelings that the revolution was not accomplishing anything that it set out to do. And he's basically been allowed to thrive. He set up his own studio paint studio in Guanabacoa, and some of his paintings sell for $10,000 and more. He's allowed to thrive so long as his opinions are not evident in his art. He told me, and they aren't. His art is basically still lives of fruit and landscape settings. Very nice, but very apolitical. He told me, however, that when he's with friends and maybe goes out to a party and asks for a drink, his drink of choice is what he calls a ha. And it is, you might recognize it as a Cuba Libre, rum and coke, because he says to consider Cuba anything like free, Cuba Libre means free Cuba, to him is a joke, and therefore ha is the way he refers to it. There are, however, some cuenta propistas who are making it, and there's no story in the book that's more dramatic or more revealing about the revolution than that of Caridad Limonta, the woman on the left, who was born in December of 1956. And Professor Goldfrank will recognize that date as being the same month that Fidel and 81 revolutionaries stuffed aboard the old fishing yacht called Granma. Granma was an American-owned yacht, arrived on the southeastern shore of Cuba to begin the insurrection. Caridad, a black Cuban, grew up in the small sugar town of Tacajo, which I visited in eastern Cuba, with her twin sister, Esperanza. So the two of them were called Caridad, Charity, and Esperanza, Hope, twin sisters, and their single mother, Zenaida. Because of Cari's gender as a woman, her race as a black Cuban, and her humble background, the daughter of a single parent living in basically a sugar mill town, she benefited mightily from the sweeping changes that the revolution initiated. She went to study in Kiev, in Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union then, and came back with a degree in economic engineering, married to another young Cuban who had studied there, also engineering, who was a proud member of the Communist Youth. Together, they formed a powerful team. He, resourceful and practical; she, ambitious and courageous. Both of them eventually having success within the party. She, with her degree, worked within the government, eventually running an aluminum factory in Guanabacoa, and then rising from level to level within light industry, taking over the entire textile industry in the company called Puntex, importing and exporting, and rising finally to the post of Vice Minister of Light Industry for all of Cuba, as well as becoming a ranking member of the Communist Party. She believed wholeheartedly in the revolution and in Fidel. But as the years passed, and she discerned that many of the lofty promises were not being kept, her loyalty to the party wavered. Eventually, it was not shortages or economic hardship that made her see things differently, but the recognition that she'd enjoyed many advantages because of her positions that contradicted the revolution's most elemental promise of equality for all. Basically, everyone is equal, but if you were a vice minister, you were more equal than others. She decided eventually to give it all up, and that's making very short work of her moment of recognition and her transformation. We can go into it more later, or I invite you to read the book because it's a complicated but fascinating story. She decided to eventually give it all up: her job, her state car, her state computer, everything. And with her retirement pension being just $12 a month, which is not nearly enough to live on, she began sort of doing what she knew in an abstract sense because she had been in charge of the manufacturers, but had never actually worked a sewing machine herself, creating and selling something that in Latin countries are known as basically a very popular, they're crib sets. There are things that you give to an expectant mother to prepare the bassinet for the baby, using as her prime material old hotel sheets that she bought in Guanabacoa. Kadi is a woman of tremendous energy and courage. She has become one of the most successful entrepreneurs and self-employed people, even so far as to say budding capitalists in Cuba. So successful that when President Obama went to Havana to visit in 2016, the first US president since Calvin Coolidge to be in Cuba, she was among the group of entrepreneurs who met with him. Then the Trump administration reversed many aspects of the Obama opening, drying up the optimistic hope that she and other Cubans had that things finally were changing. For her, for Kadi, the revolution is lost. That's what she told me. It's not easy for her to say, but though she no longer belongs to the party or pledges allegiance to the socialist system, she remains to Cuba, to the idea of Cuba and the unique place it occupies in the world. She harbors no hard feelings towards Americans. In fact, no Cuban I met ever did or expressed it to me. She seeks some middle ground, not wanting the US to simply give up on them, nor desiring that the current regime survive indefinitely. For her and for many Cubans, the future would be better if they simply had more freedom, more opportunity, a better relationship with other countries, especially the United States. But she does not want the unbridled capitalism of, say, our society, nor a government that would leave the sick, the poor, the elderly, and the desperate to their own devices. She likes some of the things, like the health care that's available to everyone, and the education. But somehow in a system that would provide more freedom and independence for her and people like her and her son. Does she think it will ever happen? Well, if you look over to the right of your screen, that small electric fan that she uses in her home is called Hopeful. And if you ask her if she thinks it will ever happen, it will depend on what day you ask. Her spirits were much higher and she was much more optimistic before the changes and the restrictions of 2017. And they've hardly ever been lower than they are right now. Conditions there, if you've read anything about Cuba, people wait online 8 hours for some chicken. There are no supplies of hardly anything. Worse, she said when I talked to her just a week ago, than it was in 1994. But even so, her love for Cuba remains inextinguishable, a love that comes out so very clearly in the pages of the Cubans' Ordinary Lives in Extraordinary Times that I encourage you to read. But for people like Kadi, who are most extraordinary, although their lives may be ordinary, they are extraordinary. These times are times that mean something special for them and eventually for us as well in the United States. So now that we're back, I have a question for the group to consider now or later when all of this starts to percolate in your mind. So the US is a global superpower and has for more than 60 years has had as its stated policy the termination of the Castro-led communist socialist government of Cuba and the restoration of democracy to the island. The history between the US and Cuba is long and complicated, dating back to the origins of our own country. At the time that Fidel Castro took over, Cuba had a population of roughly 6.5 million people. Today, The population is around 11 million, basically the same as Ohio, with more than 1 million expats living in the US, majority of them in South Florida. The Castro regime has been accused many times of violating human rights, of depriving its citizens of basic rights, including travel, and mismanaging the economy and sending what was once one of the most well-developed countries in the hemisphere into a tailspin from which some fear it will never recover. The regime has also fomented revolution throughout Latin America and the African continent. The Trump administration has linked Cuba to the regimes in Nicaragua and Venezuela, the infamous troika of tyranny, and has imposed economic sanctions on them. But nothing compares to the 60 years of aggression that Washington has shown toward Cuba and collaterally towards its people, ordinary people like Caridad. I believe it is important, as this policy shows no signs of ending, to understand what those people are living through. We in class or in debates and discussions can endlessly parse through how much of current conditions there can be blamed on the embargo and how much on the greed and incompetence of the regime. But we also should focus attention on the reality of these ordinary lives and the immeasurable cost of what they are living through because of this policy. So, should US policy continue to be tightening restrictions, as were those announced last week at the White House, when we know about the adaptability, the almost bottomless adaptability of Cubans? Or was the engagement policy offered by the Obama-Biden administration that candidate Biden says he would pursue with more demands for change on the part of the Cuban regime, if elected, the more effective path? So that's probably enough for me right now. Dean Halpin, Dean Smith, if you want to take it back and open it up to questions. I think we've covered a little bit.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's a great presentation, very informative. Appreciated the pictures too. It's great to see the visuals of the ordinary people and their extraordinary lives. So at this time, I will take any questions or comments from our audience. You can write them in the chat or raise your hand, and just to avoid any possible technical issues, if I'm not addressing your question, you can put your camera on to let me know, or put your let me know in the chat that I missed your hand. Okay, I see Professor Alvarez Amel and then Anthony DeFlorio. Professor, I think your mic is muted.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much, Anthony DePalma, for your lecture and for your knowledge of Cuba, which, you know, there is a book that starts out with a cryptic phrase, but so very true, that we Cubans are condemned to have others to have others tell our stories. This is not a criticism of you, but this is a remark that I've lived through all of my life. Okay, live outside of Cuba, having others tell me what's going on in Cuba. And I have just one remark, two questions. Number one, I understand the American confidence in thinking that they can decide what happens to Cuban. In fact, I remember in one of the last wedding parties I went to, an American, as yourself, married to a Cuban, who told me, "Don't worry, we'll fix it." And as you know from Cuban history, from the 19th century, the Cuban symbol is a key. Cubans are keenly aware of the the geographical importance of the place where we're, this small underpopulated island, typically what this big perception we have of ourselves is owed to our geographical position, practically. Okay, and that's one thing because when President Obama went, I cheered when he spoke of democracy, in Cuba, but actually repression, as you know, increased after President Obama's visit. So this discussion about the American embargo, which has played into the hands of the dictatorship, because they can say, oh, the wicked Yankees, are persecuting us. But ultimately, Cuba is a trading position which Europeans are jockeying to get into. In my estimation, waiting for you Americans to come in, And so I am confused about this. While I understand, because we all think from our point of view, Americans give an enormous emphasis on their embargo or not embargo. I've been all over the place with this issue. I no longer, as you know, poor little Cuba, Gaesa is one of the biggest hotel consortiums in Latin America, and is owned by the Cuban military. So I don't know what would Americans, in fact, contribute, hopefully, to the democracy in Cuba. The second thing, and this is the second issue. I have to read your book, and I thank you for publishing it. But the second issue is, and I'm speaking from an experience, from a personal experience. As you know, there is a phrase in Cuba, double morality. Okay, Cubans will say one thing in front of you and then turn around and say the other thing. And I've had this experience with Cubans who will say one thing to someone who's a foreigner, and then when they speak to me, I was born in Cuba, they will say the opposite, So what gives you the confidence when you say that people who sided with the government, especially when Castro was initially all over the place and politically, what gives you the confidence that you did in fact get sincere expressions of what people believed? So those two things. What ultimately is the importance of the American embargo, number one, in effective terms, and number two, how can you really ascertain whether the statements you had were really sincere statements of people's political beliefs? Thank you very much for publishing, and saludos a tu esposa también. Ciao.
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'll try to answer as honestly as I can. I think, Dean Halpin, I think it is important to go back to some of what we said at the very beginning about some of your students wanting to sort of combine journalism and foreign affairs. So that comes right down on my shoulders. And one of the sort of guiding principles of Western journalism has always been that, as Diana said, there's an issue about an outsider telling us about ourselves, but we know from experience that being an outsider can help you become more objective as you look at things. So if a Cuban were to write this book, it would be a very, very different book than the one that I wrote. For instance, if she wrote it, it would be from her perspective, and it would be difficult for her to sort of see the other side. That's one reason why foreign correspondence developed, why we send foreign correspondents to a country to look at it with fresh eyes, without all of the baggage that comes with being a part of that society. So as a professional journalist of many decades experience, and understanding that I'm talking to people who have all the reason in the world to lie to me, but I was there for 3 years. It wasn't just one interview on an afternoon where they could have said anything or not, and then I'd be gone. And I talked, and most of these people know each other, so I was able to cross-check one with the other. So I felt in the end, of course, there's no guarantee that they're not the opposite of what they told me. There's no absolute guarantee. But from 3 years now, coming up on 4 years of working with them, knowing them intimately, and gaining their confidence. You know when you've gained their confidence. And I did it as an American, but not just as an American, because as the professor said, my wife is Cuban. I've been going to Cuba since 1979. I've invested a lot in it without really taking a side one way or the other, simply trying to be objective. So I feel, and I hope the readers feel, that they can trust what's in there. The embargo is so big and amorphous an issue. It's hard to, in just the little time we have, to answer the question. But let's say it's not just the embargo that prevents them from buying a new Chevy. It's the embargo that prevents them from buying a Chevy from Mexico that was manufactured in Mexico, because the Mexicans, there are aspects of the embargo that are extraterritorial, that go outside of our borders. And it's that aspect of it that makes it actually effective in shutting things down, because you could get, every time I go there, I'm asked to bring ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is pretty generally made everywhere, but the Cubans would have trouble buying it from us. Medicines are excluded from the embargo, but you have to pay in cash, and they're cash poor. They could buy it from Mexico, but a company that made it in Mexico would never be able to do business in the United States if they sold it to Cuba. There are a lot of loopholes. There are a lot of, the embargo now is Swiss cheese. There have been so many exemptions and changes over the years, but it's not, even if Trump wanted to, or if Joe Biden wins, even President Obama, when he was in office, they could not unilaterally lift the embargo because it's an act of Congress. So it's effective. And the whole business of what business Americans have of thinking they can change the regime in Cuba, I'm going to leave that to someone else.
Anthony DeFlorio, you're up.
Yeah, great. I'll throw out my camera because I haven't seen you in a minute,
Hey!
so it's great to see you.
Great to see you.
Yeah, great. Great presentation. Looking forward to reading the book. My question, basically focuses more on the reporting process. Tell us a little bit about how you wanted to tackle such a mammoth topic, why you chose to take it through the lens of ordinary people or extraordinary people with these stories, and if there's something that you could have maybe changed or something that you could kind of revise, or something that maybe went awry in the process that you had to deal with. Any of those anecdotes, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I knew from the beginning that the project proposal was to look at it through the eyes of ordinary people. Having been involved with Cuba since the 1970s, and all the time I was at the New York Times and having worked in Mexico and in Cuba, I knew that we had heard more than enough from Fidel. So I really set out to do a book that almost didn't mention him, and certainly didn't focus on him. Because if you look, you just Google his name or go on Amazon for Fidel, and there'll be more books. It hasn't really helped us understand it from this level. And So I wanted to do it that way, and it's work that I've done before, and I enjoy doing it, and I think I have some skill at doing it. What you have to do from a journalistic point of view, even if you've got 3 or 4 years, you have to accelerate intimacy, and I think we've talked about this before. So the normal process of getting to know people, like the folks that you work with at Seton Hall, it might be 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. Your neighbors, it takes years to get to know people. You don't have that much time. I mean, even though I had 4 years, I had to gain their confidence much earlier in order to get them to talk to me. So there are ways to do that. And I had a natural advantage in that, although I am not Cuban and I was not born in Cuba, someone very close to me was. And with Latins in Cuba and many other places, any kind of a family connection makes you family. So it made sense for me to be the person who's going to do this book based on my experience. Everything from a previous book, The Man Who Invented Fidel, which I did, to the work at the New York Times and writing Fidel's obituary, right, that ran in the New York Times. So that gave me a certain perspective and a certain lever to get into. So then you have to decide, well, how am I going to do a book about that? Do I pick 6 different communities? Do I just try to get a broad range of people? Do I do an ordinary New York Times book, which would be a chapter on education, a chapter on politics, a chapter on culture, a chapter on music, and do it all like that? I felt it was, and dealing with the editors at Viking, who were terrific. And by the way, Viking is John Steinbeck's publisher, so it couldn't have been better for me. We decided that it would make sense to pick one place. Now, it had to be a place that was neither too rich, if it was possible for that to happen in Cuba, where I doubt it, or too poor, where basically those extraordinary times and people starting their own business just wasn't happening. So that left out a lot of the rural areas of Cuba. It had to be a place that was not too firmly ensconced in the revolution, where everybody was a revolutionary and nobody talked about anything else, nor filled with dissidents. And dealing with dissidents is a whole other issue because the government is still very sensitive about it. I needed a place that was not Havana, central Havana, the historic district that everybody knows. But when I reread Children of Sanchez, I realized that Oscar Lewis had done it in basically a neighborhood of Mexico, but it didn't ever appear that way. It was only after I had lived in Mexico that I realized that's what he did. So then it struck me that it was possible to find something that was close enough that logistically would be possible. So another part of it is the logistics. I have to be able to get in there. There are 2 ways to do it. I apply for a visa as a journalist, which means I have to lay out all my project and have it approved by the government, or do it with all of the impact that would have. Government knowing where I was going, who I was talking to, or I could do it without the government, which meant I had to go in with a tourist visa and stay up to 60 days and then have to leave and come back. Fortunately for me, although I started the book after the election, the Obama-Biden opening was still there. So there were daily flights from Newark Airport to Havana that were relatively cheap. And so I essentially commuted for 3 years. And I mentioned before we went on air, that I was there at immigration so often that the immigration officer, I thought was going to suspect something, maybe spying for the CIA, suspected that I had a girlfriend in Cuba, which I didn't abuse him of, just to be able to get back and forth. So I hadn't planned on doing that. There were other plans that didn't work out, so I had to go in and out all the time, which made it more difficult in a way. But I was lucky enough to meet Caridad. I started with no one. I called a friend who's a journalist in Florida, Tim Paget, and asked him if he knew, after I had selected Guanabacoa, did he know anybody from Guanabacoa? And it turned out that he did. And he knew Cari because she had come with a group during the opening to Miami, as part of one of those dog and pony shows about Cuban entrepreneurs. So he gave me her name, said, she was a member of the party. So although she's got her own business, I'm not sure where she is. I contacted her, and she turned out to be ideal. Being born within 3 weeks of the beginning of the revolution and going through her trajectory, being a Black woman that dealt with all of those issues, and also being brave as a badger and having a memory that was lock solid. Mm-hmm. So through her, I started. She introduced me to the head of the CDR, who was the strict communist. They were not only friends, Cari was her maid of honor when she got married. So I had two of them from two opposite sides. And in the book, their relationship and their differences really comes out. And then once I picked Guanabacoa, you do what you do as a journalist. You sort of walk around, find this, talk to that person, ask somebody else. Some people said yes, some people said no. I already knew a little bit about the tugboat, which I thought would really broaden it, but I didn't have any context there. And the government had already said it as all I was going to say about it. But I had reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that I used. So all of that really worked out together. If it had, the only thing I didn't find was a single project that either the town or all of those people were working toward. This is really nuts and bolts, to give it more of a narrative arc. So I had to use something that was less concrete than a project, and it was Caridad's effort to keep her son in Cuba, which is the narrative that continues all the way through to the very end. But otherwise, I was very lucky. Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise. We should catch up.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor DePalma. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today, and we learned a lot. I look forward to posting this for the rest of our students to be able to view, and best of luck with the launch of your book.
Thank you so much. One last thought, that borders can limit the extent of countries, but they can't limit the extent of friendships. That's a good one for your students, especially in the diplomacy school. I wish you all the best for this crazy, crazy academic year. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to address the audience.
Thank you so much.
You.
And thank you for the beautiful sentiment.